Supported by 3FM 92.7 Accra.
Well, hello and welcome to Hot Issues. This week we are taking a look at the sea. The sea is not just a body of water in which we fish and in which sometimes we throw waste and so on. It's guided by laws. It has its own security problems and so on. This week, we want to take a look at the sea and the law governing it. Welcome to Hot Issues. Hello, welcome back to Hot Issues. And as I indicated from the beginning, we are taking a look at the sea. We are looking at the sea in terms of the resources in it, what laws govern the exploitation of these resources, what is the relationship between countries, what is the significance of the sea, what about piracy and so on. We are taking a very, very comprehensive look at the sea. And we are indeed privileged to have with us Commander Dr. Kamal Deen of the Ghana Navy. His many things, his expertise include the law, he's been on peacekeeping operations, he's supposed to have written a book and so on. Sir, you're welcome to the studio.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction.
Yes, sir. Now, Commander, we understand that you've written a book. What's the book about?
The book takes a very deep look at the Gulf of Guinea, that is the west coast of Africa, analyzing the strategic importance of the maritime domain, the security issues, and here security is broadly defined to include the economic and political security of the countries, looking at the legal framework that exists for the maritime domain, the attempts at ensuring comprehensive responses to some of the challenges that we have, and also taking a deep look at the external involvement in the Gulf of Guinea. So that is a summary of what the book is about, and the book is titled Maritime Security Cooperation in the Gulf of Guinea, Prospects and Challenges.
When you talk about the strategic importance of the Gulf of Guinea, what are you talking about? Are you talking about it in terms of sojourning? Or what? What is the strategic value of the Gulf of Guinea?
We're trying to look at the strategic importance of the maritime domain to coastal states. If you are very lucky to be a coastal state, then you are very lucky indeed. Because if you look at history, all nations that rose to power must be coastal states and have been coastal states. So having the coast alone means that you have the potential to achieve greatness. So that is first and foremost the strategic importance of the coast. Then you're looking at the maritime space of the Gulf of Guinea, and you are looking at the socio-economic and political benefits that we can derive from that for members of the coastal states that are littoral, that is contiguous to the Gulf of Guinea, and the wider world. But we can also look at the strategic importance in historical sense. The sea was the conduit of our colonialism. Indeed, although we always talk about the partition of Africa, if you took a very deep look at the instrument that partitioned Africa, you realize that it didn't just talk about the land boundaries, it also talked about the sea. So it means that historically the sea has always been important, and it is so important today.
What about the commercial, social and economic value of the sea? Apart from it being a body of water with fishes and so on, what is the value?
That is very enormous. First of all, the sea is the main modus of transportation in the world. If you look around us, you realize that 70% of the physical things that we have, that is the non-living things, are brought into this country one way or the other by the sea. So that is an indication of how important the sea is. You have many ships that are traversing the sea, and the economic value of those ships and the cargo that is being carried is important. From a resource point of view, the sea is a vast area for resource, and that is a point that I wish to emphasize. Because if you looked at the land, we always talk about resources on land. But take the case of Ghana. 70% of Ghana's territory is at sea. And if you look at it from the point of view that that territory is uninhabited, it doesn't have population, it doesn't have rules, it doesn't have ownership that is accruing to individuals, then you realize that we are having a much bigger space at sea that is of economic importance in terms of the resources. And here we are not talking about the living resources. We are not even talking about just the non-living resources like oil and gas that has become so important to this country, but we are talking about renewable resources and ever-increasing scientific discovery that is showing enormous potential of the sea. And all those resources constitute the economic potential of the sea.
What are some of the renewable resources in the sea?
Renewable resources, first, we can look at generating, for example, electricity or energy from wind currents and from sea currents. So these are two that we can talk about. But we are also talking about a lot of genetic material. In fact, science is showing that the sea is the means for getting the medicinal properties that most of the pharmaceutical companies are relying on now. Deep seabed activity is taking place, and within the deep seabed, a lot of organisms that are critical for curing some of the otherwise incurable ailments that we have are being discovered at sea. So this is the potential of the sea, and huge pharmaceutical companies are investing in these resources. But we are even talking about mineral deposits that also exist in the sea. Indeed, in the 1980s, it was thought that there will be so many precious minerals that will be harvested or exploited from the sea that diamond will become irrelevant, and those resources still exist.
Well, recently there was a rush for gold from the beaches of Elmina.
Yes.
Is that an indication that there may be gold in the sea?
Certainly, it's an indication that there may be gold in the sea, and you realize that Namibia is also within the west coast of Africa, and Namibia has been exploiting gold from the sea for some time now, and diamond actually from the sea. So that is an indication of the potential that we have in the sea.
Now, when we talk of the Gulf of Guinea, what are we talking about?
This term
is it just the sea in front of Ghana, or what? What is the Gulf of Guinea?
This term has actually become very important in the last few years. Although historically we have always had the Gulf of Guinea. In this strictest definition, it is used to describe the Gulf. And that Gulf will be the area from, say, Cote d'Ivoire to somewhere around Cameroon, the Gulf, the curvature. So that is the Gulf of Guinea. But we are having an expanded notion of the Gulf of Guinea now, and we are looking at the entirety of the west coast of Africa, at least from Cape Verde to Angola. And we are not looking at just the maritime space, but we are also looking at the synergy between the maritime space, or the continuity between the maritime space and the land, which means the coastal states and even some of the landlocked states. So this is what I call an evolving conceptual definition of the Gulf of Guinea.
Now, this Gulf of Guinea, what is so peculiar about it? Why is it different from other seas? What makes it so special?
I think in contemporary times, the Gulf of Guinea is very important in a number of ways. One, increasing oil and gas discoveries in the Gulf of Guinea. The Gulf of Guinea is the most active maritime space in the world. We are having a lot of resources in terms of oil and gas, and there's enormous investment across the Gulf of Guinea, and much of the investment is moving seaward. Originally, most of the countries were looking for oil and gas in the land, but ever since Nigeria started finding oil at sea, it became apparent that there's a lot of deposits of oil at sea, oil and gas. And Ghana has struck oil. Cameroon, of course, also had oil at sea. The wells dried, and there's a renewal of the wells. So across the Gulf of Guinea, there's increasing discovery of oil and gas. And that is the most strategic that's one of the key strategic importance of the Gulf of Guinea in recent times. Because you can look at the massive investment in these resources. Look at Ghana alone. Look at the Jubil fields. Look at the Chiniboa fields that is coming on board. Take a platform like the SOP, Kwame Nkrumah, and many others that are located across the Gulf of Guinea. These are strategic assets. Secondly, we are talking about submarine cables. The Gulf of Guinea is very important because it links many of the continents in the world. And that is done through submarine cable, because communication is through cables, and the sea provides the medium for laying those cables. So there are strategic cables in the Gulf of Guinea that if there is an interruption, so far as damage to the cables are concerned, that can affect just not in the Gulf of Guinea, just not the Gulf of Guinea, but the rest of the world. So that is the second strategic importance. We can talk about a localized asset like the West African gas pipeline that is carrying gas from Nigeria through Togo and Benin to Ghana, another vital and strategic asset. Then we are looking at the sea routes, because the Gulf of Guinea is one of the shortest way of moving from the east coast of Africa to Latin America and to America. And I'm saying it's one of the shortest way, just not in terms of distance, but in terms of its strategic nature. If you wanted to go the other way, you go through what we call choke points. But the Gulf of Guinea is massive area of water, and that means that large vessels can traverse the Gulf of Guinea carrying huge quantity of goods and critical assets that are needed by countries. So that is the strategic importance of the Gulf of Guinea in terms of its global sense. But for the countries, of course, you are looking at the economic potential that lies in the Gulf of Guinea. You are looking at the insecurity that may present itself from the Gulf, from the maritime environment. You are looking at the living resources, you are looking at the non-living resources, and you are looking at boundary issues that may arise within that region.
If you're looking at living resources, what are those living resources? Are they just the fishes?
No, you can talk about living resources in three forms. We're talking about those that exist in the water column, and that is normally the fish. And we can also talk about the mammals, sharks, and the rest. But we are talking about living resources that exist at the bottom of the sea, and that's what we call sedentary species. And those are very important as well. So we are talking about mussels, you are talking about all the seafoods that we eat. That doesn't exist in the water column. They are always stuck to the seabed, but of very high economic value. Except that we are not a very typical seafood country, so we don't realize the economic potential of those resources. But those resources are harvested from our waters and are sold across the world. So that is the second scope of living resources that you can talk about. Then you are talking about the organisms that I mentioned. Living resources that are in the form of organisms that are crucial in generating genetic material for pharmaceutical industries.
How much of the sea belongs to Ghana, and how much belongs to the world?
That is a very important question. How much of the sea belongs to Ghana? Not long ago, in 2013, I believe, I was at a conference in Sydney, where one of the greatest thinkers, maritime thinkers of the world from India, made a very profound statement by saying that the South China Sea do not belong to China. The Indian Ocean is not for India, so other oceans may not be for the countries. So what I'm trying to say is that yes, it's right for you to say and for you to ask how much of that sea belongs to us. But we can talk about what belongs to us. First of all, we can talk about the territorial sea. The territorial sea is what is 12 nautical miles into the sea. By the rules of international law, we have sovereignty over the territorial sea. And this is replicated in our constitution. If you look at Article 4241 of our constitution, it defines the territories of Ghana to be the 10 regions of Ghana before the coming into force of the constitution and the territorial sea. Then the sub-article that follows says that Parliament shall delimit the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf. What that means is that that body of water, that is the exclusive economic zone, and the continental shelf, which is the seabed, is also an environment that belongs to Ghana. You can talk about this in terms of its physical space, about 64,000 kilometers square. And that is very enormous in terms of a maritime space. But it is, when you talk about the territorial sea and the exclusive economic zone, you don't see that same exclusivity as we find in the land component. Even within the territorial sea, there are rights that accrue to other users. And in the exclusive economic zone, our rights there are what we call sovereign rights, which means that our rights will have to coexist with the rights of other users of the sea. But this is where you then have competing rights. And that is why I mentioned, I quoted what that thinker said when he said the Indian Ocean doesn't belong to India and the South China Sea does not belong to China. So that is why I mentioned it.
Territorial sea, an economic exclusive zone.
Yes.
What is it? Are they the same? Are they different? What is it?
They are different legally. In terms of space, when you talk about territorial sea, you are looking at 12 nautical miles. So if we are looking at the conversion, we are looking at something like 18 kilometers into the sea, and that is the territorial sea. And juridically, the territorial sea is a zone of sovereignty. So what it means is that the sovereignty of Ghana extends to the territorial sea. And what it also means is that generally, we have absolute control over the territorial sea in terms of resources, in terms of decision making, in terms of governance. We have absolute control over the territorial sea. Then you talk about the exclusive economy zone. The exclusive economy zone is from the 12 nautical mile to the 200 nautical mile. But generally speaking, we always say the exclusive economy zone is up to about 200 nautical miles. Within that zone, we don't have sovereignty. We have what we call sovereign rights. And you have used the proper terminology when you emphasize the economic. Because what we have there is sovereign rights for the purposes of exploring, exploiting, managing, and conserving the living and non-living resources. This description is generally seen as economic, but it is not limited to economics. Through the economic dimension, we also have certain socio-political rights within that maritime space, but it is largely viewed in the form of an economic right or economic rights that we have in the exclusive economy zone.
I still don't get the difference. I mean, if we have the right to explore, to exploit, and so on, within a distance of 200 nautical miles, how come that we don't have sovereignty over that? What is sovereignty?
Yes, that is the compromise that the international community arrived at after negotiating the Law of the Sea Convention from 1973 to 1972. Sovereignty means that, generally speaking, our jurisdiction as a country extends to the limit of the territorial sea. It means that the full scale of our political jurisdiction, our legal jurisdiction in terms of the application of all the laws of this country, and the enforcement jurisdiction exists up to the territorial sea. What it means? 12 nautical miles. Yes, so that is why it is called sovereignty. The full sovereignty that we have exists up to the territorial sea. But this has been tempered with what we call the right to other uses. And what is that right? The right of innocent passage. What it means is that other vessels can just pass through the water to the extent that they do not threaten the sovereignty of Ghana. So that is the sovereignty. When we talk about the exclusive economy zone, the full scale of our legal and political jurisdiction cannot be enforced in the exclusive economy zone. But we then have patches of pockets of rights relating to issues and some aspects. For example, fisheries. We have control over the fisheries. We have control over the seabed resources. But when it comes to the exclusive economy zone, there is what we call, for example, freedom of navigation. Freedom of navigation means that other users of the sea can't use the exclusive economy zone without seeking permission from Ghana. And they can undertake other activities in the exclusive economy zone. It can be military exercises, for example. They can lay submarine cables, and they can even undertake some form of marine scientific research in the exclusive economy zone. Whereas all these things cannot be done in the territorial sea. So that is the strict legal definition in terms of the territorial sea and the exclusive economy zone.
Recently, we had a lot of problems with pearl trawling and fishing generally in the Gulf of Guinea, in the Ghanaian waters, as it were. What was the nature of this problem in relation to the difference between the economic exclusive zone and the territorial, sea, the territorial waters, and so on?
I think it was largely a problem of management than one that exists in the legal distinction, because pearl trawling targets what I call the sedentary species. If we are talking about other species that exist in the water column, like tuna, for example, and that is one of the distinction between the territorial sea and the exclusive economy zone. There are certain resources within the exclusive economy zone that, even though they will ordinarily belong to the coastal state, like tuna, tuna is not seen as a resource that the coastal state has got exclusive economic control over. It is managed as a resource that is shared. We call them shared species. But going to back to the point that you mentioned, pair trawling issue was just a question about management, because they are sedentary species. They exist in our continental shelf, and as a country, we have the right to license vessels to fish those species. It's a question of whether we have to do that or we don't have to do that. The impact of granting the license on the species that exist in the water column. So that is a question of this management decision that we took, and that problem came about. But we may have what we call illegal fishing at sea. The illegal fishing is one that can occur because your management and surveillance and enforcement systems are weak, and you will have to take the measures to curtail or to prevent illegal fishing.
Well, sir, we're going to go for a short break. When we come back, I'd like to find out whether indeed pair trawling occurred within the territorial zone or within the exclusive economic zone, and then we can move on from there. Okay. So, short break. This is Hot Issues. Well, hello and welcome back to Hot Issues, and we are in conversation with Commander Dr. Kamal Deen of the Ghana Navy. Sir, pair trawling, was it a problem in the territorial waters, or was it a problem in the exclusive economic zone?
Okay, I have to make another distinction, which is important. In Ghana, we have what we call the inshore fishing zone, and we have what we call the rest of the maritime space. And this distinction is not a global distinction. It's a national distinction that we have made for purposes of fisheries enforcement. The inshore zone generally coincides with the territorial sea, the inshore zone. And what it means is that we have reserved exclusive fishing in the inshore zone to canoes, smaller canoes, so that they can have access to those resources. And it's a very, very profitable area of fisheries. Then what we call the rest of the maritime space. Generally, the Ministry of Fisheries will not license a pair trawling vessel to pair trawl within the inshore zone. So here, strictly speaking, we'll be talking about the inshore zone and the rest of the maritime space. But generally, the inshore zone coincides with the territorial sea. So if I want to use the same description, then we can say that pair trawling occurred outside the territorial sea, which is also outside the inshore fishing zone.
But we still have jurisdiction.
Yeah, we still have jurisdiction, and we have the right and to some extent the obligation to control the pair trawling. And unless that pair trawling vessel is doing that illegally, we ought to have known that it was licensed to do pair trawling.
Now, beyond pair trawling, what are some of the other problems that we have with fishing?
Some of the problems that we have with fishing, there are many other problems. One is what we call fishing with unprescribed equipments. It could be the size of the net that is being used. It could be the method of fishing, for example, using explosive to fish. It could even be using things like poison to fish. So that is one of the main problems that we have. But we may also have illegal fishing, which means vessels that are not supposed to fish in our waters coming to our waters and taking the fish. Of course, you can understand the enormity of the problem. The maritime space is vast, and we don't have, even on land, when we have ice all over, there is still crime. So you can then look at the maritime space where we don't have many ice, there are fewer vessels, and the monitoring and enforcement can become difficult. So one of the key problems that you may have relating to fisheries is illegal fishing, and that is enormous within the coast of West Africa.
What role has the Ghana Navy been playing in checking and wholesome fishing practices in our seas?
The Ghana Navy, under the fisheries enforcement regime that we have in Ghana, has been licensed or authorized to enforce fisheries regulations. We call it authorized officers. So the Navy will normally go to sea and enforce fisheries regulation. First of all, ensure that those vessels that have been licensed to fish by the government of Ghana and the authorities of Ghana are doing so in an environment that there's no risk. Secondly, ensuring that they are doing the right thing. So the Ghanaian Navy, for example, with the Fisheries Ministry, certain times they are embarked on the Ghanaian Navy ship, will inspect the fish that is being caught to be sure that they are the right sizes of fish that are being caught, to inspect the gear and the equipment that are being used. So this is the role of the Ghanaian Navy. And also to ensure that the regulation relating to transshipment and landing of fish, that regulation is enforced and adhered to.
Is the Ghana Navy sufficiently prepared and equipped to undertake this task?
I will say that to some extent, yes, because in terms of looking at us with our neighbors, we do have sufficient platforms, and those platforms are very active, and they can be deployed at sea. Of course, in an ideal situation, we should have more platforms than we are having, because if we look at the environment that the Ghanaian Navy will have to patrol and to enforce law and order, that is a very vast area. You are looking at the Navy as the only police at sea. So you can then look at the number of platforms that are required for the Navy to be at sea. Looking into the future also, it will be important to get platforms that can stay longer at sea. Of course, those platforms cost a lot of money, but once you are able to harness the economic derivatives of the maritime domain, then you can think about investing that into some of those platforms that could stay at sea, for example, for 1 week or 2 weeks before coming to shore.
Now, sir, I want us to take a look at drug smuggling. And over the last couple of years, it's becoming obvious that the sea has become a route for drug smuggling. I mean, only a few weeks ago, some people who were trying to move marijuana to Nigeria were caught. They were trying to use the sea. Yeah. And then there's the case of the 77 parcels allegedly on MV Benjamin and so on. What is the size of the problem when it comes to drug smuggling?
At the global level, it's a very huge problem. And even a country like America is contending with that, between America and the Caribbean region. Because we are not talking about just drugs being carried in the surface of the sea, but we are even talking about drugs being carried beneath the sea. We now have what we call submarine drug vessels, and they are specially constructed, loaded with drugs, and then they submerge, and then they can go far away and then deliver the cargo, the drug cargo that is being carried. So it's a huge problem globally. And in terms of the Gulf of Guinea and in this country, we are looking at what we call the triangle of drug movement. Drugs moving from Latin America, being landed within the Gulf of Guinea, and then will then move by land or by air into Europe. So that is where we exist in the triangle. And it is a huge problem because these vessels will carry drugs. Of course, the quantities are huge and the economic value is a lot. And the drugs will come into the west coast of Africa, transshipped into canoes and other vessels, and they are landed ashore or landed at the coast and then taken on land. We also have a second modus that is being used and employed, and that is drugs coming by containers. The drugs will come ordinarily and stuck in containers that are carrying ordinary cargo, and then the drugs will then come also into the region. It seems to me that for some time the method was bringing what we call the drug cargo vessels, but when enforcement officials started looking into that direction, the operators and the transnational organized crime networks changed and started using the container method. And I'm sure that the enforcement officials are looking into that direction again. So we can talk about the two means of drug trafficking existing as at this time. And you, of course, know the implications of drugs to the security and to the stability of every region. And if you looked at the numbers in terms of the drugs that is being landed into this region and transshipped outside this region, the economic value is huge. If you take a country like Guinea-Bissau, for example, 10 10% of the value of drugs that enter Guinea-Bissau and move out of Guinea-Bissau to other countries, 10% is the GDP of Guinea-Bissau. 10% of the value of the drugs that enter Guinea-Bissau and move from Guinea-Bissau into Europe is the GDP of Guinea-Bissau.
That's huge.
That's huge.
What about Ghana?
Ghana, I wouldn't think that it will be that huge in terms of, because Ghana is not too much an ideal place for large movements of drugs outside the continent. Because Guinea-Bissau is very close to Europe in that other region. When it comes to Ghana, Ghana is in the middle. Again, you can see the distinction between Ghana and Angola. So I do not know exactly what the numbers are. We will still have enormous, a good quantity of drugs coming into Ghana, but you cannot compare that to what you may find in Angola or compare that to what you may find in Guinea-Bissau.
Which are the agencies responsible for fighting drugs trafficking using the sea?
In Ghana, you are talking about the Narcotics Control Board, certainly. The Narcotics Control Board is the agency that has got the mandate. The Narcotics Control Board may then work with other agencies, such as the Navy, such as National Security, such as Immigration, in putting together a collective response.
Do we have the adequate infrastructure to combat, the drugs trade using the sea?
Again, trying to combat that means that you must have a lot of platforms, but more importantly, you should have intelligence. And when you have intelligence, you should be able to track the particular vessel that is at sea. Because you may have intelligence, but when you are out there at sea, you may not be able to track the vessel. And tracking the vessel will require you to have a ship that is built up to what I call the highest level of technology, so that you can be able to find the vessel wherever it exists at sea, using the radar system and using other means of surveillance. So that is what you require. Sufficiently, we do have platforms that are able to track vessels at sea, but you can be looking at the distance, because the kind of vessels that we have will have a limitation in terms of range, and that is a challenge that we have.
Platform, what does it mean? What is platform? Are you talking about ships, or
yes,
are you talking
yes.
about some other things?
Yes, I'm talking about ships, but I'm using platforms to refer to the various kinds of ships that we may have, because we may have interceptors, we may have patrol vessels, and depending on the particular country, you might even have an OPV. So collectively, I'm using platforms to refer to all these different kind of ships that we have at sea. But these platforms at sea are then integrated with platforms at shore in terms of surveillance, because they are sea. They will have to transmit information to shore, and that information is received on another platform that is a landed platform, and there's an integration between the platforms that are at sea and those that are on land.
Is piracy a very serious problem in the Gulf of Guinea?
Yes, it is a very serious problem in the Gulf of Guinea. Ever since we had the decline of piracy in the Indian Ocean, the Gulf of Guinea became a hotspot. Not because we haven't been having piracy, but new dynamics of piracy in the Gulf of Guinea. And we still have fewer numbers of piracy in the Gulf of Guinea compared to the South China Sea, or what I would call the Malacca Strait area. But we do have very high profile incidents of piracy within the Gulf of Guinea.
What is the nature of these high profile, incidents of piracy?
It is very typical.
What is being pirated,
Yeah. Generally in the Gulf of Guinea, oil cargo vessels are being pirated. And here I'm talking about product vessels. The vessels are carrying processed oil, and the vessel is hijacked at sea. The pirates will take the vessel for a number of days, siphon the vessel, millions of dollars, into a number of vessels, and that is sold within the region or outside the region.
But the sea is plain. I mean, how come that they are able to hijack vessels and also siphon the content and so on without anybody, knowing and seeing?
Precisely because the sea is vast and plain, and ships are very vulnerable. When a ship is laden with oil, it means that it has lesser speed. And occasionally the ship may anchor somewhere. And once the ship anchors, It is not like a vehicle that will just take off and move with speed when it wants. It will have to drift for some time. It will have to gain momentum before it is able to come to full speed. So this shows the vulnerability of ships. And generally, the pirates will be using boats, speedboats, and those speedboats will have better speed and able to intercept, for example, a product vessel. A typical speedboat could, for example, do 35 nautical miles or 40 nautical miles, whereas a typical oil vessel may be doing 18 or 20 nautical miles. So it means that this vessel is vulnerable in the face of a pirate boat. And within the Gulf of Guinea, the pirates are operating with boats. And these pirates are largely born out of the Niger Delta insurgency, and they operate with boats. So because they operate with boats, they are able to take a whole vessel. But you will remember even in Somalia, in the case of Somalia, most of the pirates were operating with very old fishing vessels, but they are still able to take huge ships at sea, because a ship at sea is generally very vulnerable. It's not like a car. It doesn't have huge speed. It will have to anchor at some point, and in any of those moments, the ship can be taken by pirates.
But I thought that ships had excellent communication gadgets and
Yes.
so on.
Yes.
So how come that they are not able to communicate when they are in distress?
Generally, they will communicate when they see pirates coming. But generally also, the closest vessel may be about another 1 or 2 nautical miles away when the situation is becoming very serious. So, and once that ship is taken by the pirates, generally you will have to avoid doing anything to endanger the ship. Even law enforcement officers will have to now calculate the form of intervention that they will have to take. Because once a vessel has been taken by pirates, anything can happen, because they are in charge now. And then you will have to be very, very tactical. You have to be very, very strategic, first of all, and tactical in your approach.
Have we had problems with piracy in Ghana?
We have had problems with piracy in Ghana, except that most of the pirates are not operating from Ghana. We've had incidents of what I would call petty robberies outside there in the anchorages of Ghana. We've had incidents of what I would call piracy, but not one that is very serious in terms of its character. But most of the serious incidents of piracy that we have had in our waters were generally conducted by operators outside our maritime domain or our region. Generally, those vessels were hijacked by elements from Nigeria, generally.
To what extent are countries in the Gulf of Guinea cooperating to deal with all of these criminal elements, drug smugglers, pirates, and so on? To what extent are we cooperating? Is there a framework for cooperation?
That is where the challenge is. There is not a robust framework for cooperation. There are a number of emerging arrangements that we have in the region. In 2013, heads of states and governments of the region adopted what we call the Yaoundé Code of Conduct, and that is supposed to be a framework for responding within the ECAS and then the ECOWAS region. But that is still not operationalized. It is being enforced, or it is being operationalized, but it takes a lot of resources to do that. It takes a lot of capacity to do that. So we don't have a very robust framework for responding to the threats that we have at sea. And seriously speaking, countries in the Gulf of Guinea will have to do something about that.
Now, if you look at the resources in the Gulf of Guinea, doesn't that also raise the possibility of conflict?
Yes, that is a major issue, especially when you are talking about the seabed resources. There's always conflict over fisheries resources because, first of all, you may have fisheries that are shared species, and this conflict is not just existing within countries in the region. For example, if we talk about tuna, for example, what we call the International Commission for Atlantic Tuna, there are over almost 50 countries that form this commission. And it will surprise you to know that countries as far away like USA are all part of the Atlantic tuna community. That is the tuna that exists in our water. So there's always a possibility of conflict over fishing resources. Within coastal communities, especially those that exist, at the boundary, there's always a possibility of conflict. Because generally, fishing communities will not respect this boundary, and they'll find some may want to cross into the other region to fish, and where fisheries resources are depleting, you can have conflict within the coastal communities. But I think the greater risk or possibility of conflict is over seabed resources, oil and gas. Because generally, it is difficult to share those resources, and those resources are seen in the form of exclusivity because they are very strategic resources. So, and that is a source of conflict.
Are there some known conflicts among states within the Gulf of Guinea?
Yes, there are some some known conflicts.
There used to be the conflict over the Bakassi Peninsula, but
yes,
that appears to have been resolved.
Generally, it has been resolved now. After the judgment of the International Court of Justice in the land boundary case between Nigeria and Cameroon, that has generally been resolved. But there are interesting issues that may pop up in future, still even between Cameroon and Nigeria. In the face of what we call the submission for extended shelf, you would have heard a few years ago that Ghana was applying to extend its maritime space. That is an opportunity that exists for every country to do that. And Cameroon has filed for extension. And when you look at the extension that has been filed by Cameroon, there are some areas where Nigeria and Equatorial Guinea has got what we call a joint development zone, which means that literally that area is supposed to belong to the two countries. Yet further at sea, ahead of that area, Cameroon has put in a claim. It's more like going under the joint development zone and coming out and claiming a space that is beyond the joint development zone. So that is a potential source of conflict. Of course, the Commission has still not looked into and approved Cameroon's claim, but that is a potential source of conflict. Of course, Cameroon, Nigeria and Equatorial Guinea solve part of the possible conflict by entering into this joint development zone that I mentioned. There is a similar joint development zone also between Nigeria and then Sao Tome and Principe. And that has also curtailed the possibility of conflict. Of course, we have a maritime boundary dispute with our neighbor Cote d'Ivoire. Down there in the waters of DRC, there is a potential conflict between DRC and Angola, especially because of the Cabinda, what I call breakaway. As you know, mainland Angola is there, and then you then have the coast of DRC popping into the shore, and then you have the Cabinda region that is on the other side. And that is a source of conflict. The two states have also decided to come into an arrangement which we call a zone of common interest. But there seem to be simmering problems from DRC. It seems to me that because of the enormity of the security problems and the instability that exists in DRC, DRC is not able to fully express its view on this maritime space. Perhaps in future, when there is more stability in DRC may look more towards the sea, and that can be a source of conflict.
So we're going to go for another short break. And when we come back, I'd like to find out why Ghana finds it necessary to apply for an extension of its continental shelf. So short break, we are looking at the sea, we are looking at the law governing the sea, we are looking at the resources of the sea, and we are looking at the security problems, in the Gulf of Guinea. And we are doing that with Commander Dr. Kamal Deen of the Ghana Navy. We'll be with you shortly. Short break. Well, hello and welcome back to Hot Issues, and we are looking at the sea. The sea is very complex. There's a law governing the sea. There are the problems of the sea, petroling, there are problems with piracy, drug trafficking, and so on. And we are very, very privileged to have with us in the studio Commander Dr. Kamal Deen who is Director of Research of the Command and Staff College of the Ghana Armed Forces. As you can see, he's from the Navy. He's been involved in peacekeeping operations. He has expertise in the law and so on. Now, sir, why is Ghana seeking to extend its continental shelf?
It is an opportunity that exists within the framework of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea was negotiated for almost a decade, and it's supposed to provide a comprehensive governance regime for the sea. And within that, it allows for states to apply for what we call extended shelf, that is extended continental shelf. Now, we must understand the context of an extended continental shelf. All coastal states, provided your coast will allow you to do so, that is the configuration of your coast and the length of your coast, every coastal state is entitled to what we call 200 nautical miles of the seabed. So you are concurrently entitled to 200 nautical miles of the water column, and at the same time, you are also entitled to the seabed, which is called the continental shelf. And that is what we call a legal continental shelf. It's called a legal continental shelf because the convention says that despite, no matter the nature of the topography of your coast, you are entitled to claim a 200 nautical miles continental shelf. So you could have a very deep coast, you could have a slow and gentle seabed, you are entitled to claim a 200 nautical miles. Beyond that, the convention then stipulates other means of having what we call an extended shelf. For example, and generally, if you can demonstrate that your coast is a gentle coast, one that is what we call a natural prolongation of your landmass into the sea, and you can justify certain scientific principles or certain scientific evidence, then you are entitled to claim an area beyond the 200 nautical miles. And this was one of the important compromises that states had to enter into in negotiating the Law of the Sea Convention. Because at the time of the adoption of the convention, some states stated or insisted that by the rules of customary international law, they were entitled to claim an area beyond the 200 nautical miles. So the compromise was to say that, look, if you can demonstrate scientifically that your coast is of such a gentle nature, that there is what we call correlation between your seabed and your land, and it is what we call a natural prolongation of your land into the sea from the 200 nautical miles of the seabed. If you can demonstrate that, then you can have an extended shelf. So what Ghana did a few years ago was to play by the rules, go through the method, establish that there in some areas of our coast, it's not the entirety of our coast, that we can demonstrate a natural prolongation of our landmass into the sea. So we applied to the Commission on the Limits of Continental Shelf for the extension of our coast. That application is being considered. Part our length has already been looked into, but we are waiting to have a full implication of the determination of that application that we brought before the Commission on the Limits of Continental Shelf, which is a body that has been established within the framework of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Similar, other countries have done the same.
If we are allowed to extend our continental shelf, what impact may that make on our conflict with La Côte d'Ivoire?
It will not by itself bring the conflict, but it has an implication for the conflict. Why? Because we are extending on the same trajectory. So the issue is over the line, or what you call the boundary that we are using. But of course, what it means is that it means that if we are holding fast to that boundary, which Côte d'Ivoire may be disputing, it means that further areas at sea that otherwise should be available to every country will also become, if you want, the exclusive, in terms of the seabed resources, will become the exclusive possession of Ghana. So it has implications, but it is not the very fact of us applying for the extension that is the source of conflict. But it's because we are going to move on the same claim, and as we move on the same claim of a boundary, we are having further and further area at sea that otherwise Côte d'Ivoire could also claim. But as I said, by applying for the extension, Ghana is not doing anything extraordinary. Ghana is not being aggressive. Ghana is just doing what international law has provided. And many other countries have applied for extension, and there are even countries that cannot even claim a 200 nautical miles at sea. And the fact that you have a coast doesn't mean that you must have a 200 nautical miles. No, it's a determination of a number of factors. And those factors will determine also where the maritime boundary is going to be.
We are bordered on the east by Togo.
Yes.
And on the west by La Côte d'Ivoire, which is making claims.
Yes.
What about our eastern border? Do we have any problems with our eastern border?
Potentially also. Potentially also because generally Ghana has been applying the equidistance, and rightly so Ghana is entitled to. Because the Law of the Sea Convention says that failing agreement to the contrary, all states shall abide by the equidistance. And the equidistance is what we call the median line. So between Ghana and La Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana is saying that this is the equidistance. And generally maritime boundaries are determined on the basis of the equidistance. And
what is the equidistance? What does it mean? I mean, equidistance, what is it?
The equidistance can generally be seen as an angle of 90 degrees to the land. An angle of 90 degrees to the line that is projected into the sea. The sea coast exists, and within the sea coast it can be convex, it can be concave. You then have what we call the critical base points, and after the base points you determine your maritime space. So generally you are looking at that point that is at the tip of your coast, and of course the landmass belongs to you because you have sovereignty of the landmass. So we are looking at that point where generally, and to put it in a very from a lay point of view, where you have what we call the 90 degrees angle, and then you are then projecting that into the sea. So that is generally what we call the median line. And if you look at our median line, and because of the special nature of our coast, there's a general tendency that our median line will be seen as cutting into the maritime space of our neighbors. But that is a normal thing in the sense that Ghana is not departing from the rules of international law. Of course, it is not the case that that boundary must be a final boundary. The states can negotiate over the boundary because maritime boundaries, much like land boundaries, cannot be determined unilaterally. All boundaries by international law must be by agreement. But the point I'm making is that when it comes to the maritime space, the equidistance becomes the starting point for getting into that, for determining the maritime boundary. And to the extent that a country is on the equidistance, that country should not be seen as being aggressive.
When it comes to maritime disputes, like the one that we have with La Côte d'Ivoire, what are the instruments available for us for resolution, for final resolution, final and complete resolution? And what are the institutions that may mediate in these conflicts?
Most countries today are parties to the Law of the Sea Convention. So the Law of the Sea Convention becomes the framework and the institutions that are born out of the Law of the Sea Convention. So in terms of the rules or the legal framework, you always go back to the Law of the Sea Convention. You, for example, look at the rules relating to the delimitation of the exclusive economic zone and the rules relating to the delimitation of the continental shelf. Of course, rules are always rules and they are subject to different interpretation. Even apart from the legal interpretation, you have to do the physical and scientific things, you know, in terms of determining where the base points are and whether this is actually the median or not. Then we have the institutions. Within the Law of the Sea framework, you have what we call the dispute resolution mechanisms. And that is generally around what we call the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea. But we have the main chamber of the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea, or the main body of the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, that sits in Hamburg. But states may then go in for what we call arbitral tribunals. In the case of Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, the two countries have settled on an arbitral tribunal, still within the framework of the Law of the Sea Convention, but it is not like going to the main body of the Law of the Sea Convention, which is the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea.
Should we, ordinary people, be worried that one day we may lose oil resources, the oil resources we're exploiting today. As a result of settlement of this dispute, should we be worried?
It's very difficult to see what will be the final determination, but I think generally, to the extent that Ghana is on the equidistance, there may not be too much departure. Perhaps there will not be too much departure from the equidistance that we have now. But when international tribunals are determining a case, you cannot be sure of the full outcome. For example, both Nigeria and Cameroon had surprises in the Bakassi case. Nigeria had expectations that were not met, and even Cameroon, that is seen as the winner, had expectations that were not met. And I think generally that is what you will also take into consideration when you are before an arbitral tribunal. But I don't foresee a very drastic change in the maritime boundary that exists now.
Thank you very much, sir, for coming to the studio. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, too, for hosting us.
Well, viewers, you heard it all, and we're talking to Commander Dr. Kamal Deen, who is head of research of the Command and Staff College. He is a naval officer. He has a PhD. His specialty includes the law, especially the law of the sea. As I always say, the best always comes to you from TV3.
Supported by 3FM 92.7 Accra.